Jesus famously said, "In this world, you will have trouble." He didn't say you might have trouble. He didn't say if you're a Christian, you won't have trouble. No, he said if you're a Christian, you will have trouble. But he didn't stop there, and I'm so happy he didn't stop there. What did he say next? "But take heart, I have overcome the world." In other words, you and I, we're going to face troubling times, troubling circumstances, but we have someone in us who is greater than those circumstances. And his name is Jesus. Here's the take-home message this morning. My troubled heart will not rest until I rest in Jesus. My troubled heart will not find rest until I find that refuge named Jesus. And that's what Jesus is teaching his disciples this morning. And so we're going to start in John 14, verse 1. Jesus provides empathy for my troubled heart. Jesus provides empathy for my troubled heart. Look at verse 1. Jesus says to his disciples, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me." Now, John 13 through John 17, as a reminder, Jesus is at the Last Supper. He's speaking to his disciples. These are where we get some of the most famous words of Jesus. And in John 14:1 and in John 14:27, so twice in this chapter, he tells his disciples, "Let not your hearts be troubled." That word troubled, it means to be under severe emotional distress. He's saying, don't be emotionally distressed. And why is he saying that to them? Well, he has reason to say that to them because they are troubled. Right at the end of John 13, he said to Peter, "I'm leaving and you can't come with me." And Peter is the leader of the disciples. I think in many ways when he speaks to Peter, he's often speaking to all of them. And that would be a troubling thing to hear. I mean, because these disciples 3 years ago, they left everything to follow Jesus. They left, James and John left their father Zebedee in the boat. They left their businesses. They left their families. They left their homes. And now Jesus says, "I'm leaving and you can't come." I mean, that would be troubling. On top of that, Jesus knows over the next day, they're going to go through the most harrowing experience of their lives as Jesus is arrested, betrayed, judged in a sham trial, tortured and crucified. And on top of that, they're going to abandon him. And they're going to be left with the guilt and shame of that act. And so Jesus is getting out ahead of that and saying, "Let not your hearts be troubled." He then says to them, "Believe in God, believe also in me." And in the Greek, that can be translated, "You believe in God, believe also in me." Or even as a question, "You believe in God? Believe also in me." Here's why he's telling them that. Because he knows that when the disciples see him dying a criminal's death on a cross, that is so radically different than their understanding of what the Messiah would be, even though Jesus had told them by this time, I think 6 times that he was going to be crucified, that it was going to make them question what he'd said about himself. And he's reminding them, if you believe in the Father, don't stop believing in me over these next few days. And as I was looking at this word troubled, what I realized is this word occurs before John 14. In fact, it occurs in John 11, John 12, and John 13. And you want to know who is troubled in those chapters? Jesus himself. So you'll see these verses up on the screen. And this is why I say that Jesus provides empathy for my troubled heart. Because Jesus, when he came to his disciples, he wasn't coming to them out of a place of someone who had never been troubled. No, Jesus took on flesh. He knew what it meant to be severely emotionally distressed. There in John 11:33, this is when Jesus is at the death of Lazarus. And when he saw Mary weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. So if you've lost a loved one, and that has been an emotionally distressing thing, Jesus understands that. Lazarus was one of his best friends. And so Jesus was troubled by that. In John 12:27, he says, "Now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And there he is contemplating the physical, emotional, spiritual cost of the cross. And when Jesus thought about that, as you can imagine, it troubled his soul. And it wasn't just because of the emotional cost of being humiliated, like stripped naked and put on a cross. It wasn't just the physical cost of the torment of nails being driven through his hands and his feet. I think greater than those things was the spiritual cost. The idea that he was going to drink the full cup of the wrath and fury of God against all sin. And so when he thought about that, he was troubled. Then in John 13:21, this is when he's thinking about the fact that one of the men he'd raised up for 3 years would betray him. It says that Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." And so Jesus was troubled, and he gets to John 14, and he tells his disciples, "Let not your hearts be troubled." Now, here's what's amazing about Jesus as a leader of these disciples. In the very moment when they should be supporting him, he's supporting them. I mean, they should be coming around him and saying, "This is going to be a really hard day for you, Jesus, and you've given everything to us." That's not how it works. Jesus was supporting them in his time of need. And, that tells us something about who we serve and who our Lord is. That if you're troubled this morning, if you're under severe emotional distress, you're just trying to get through the next hour, the last thing you want to do in the world this morning is get up and come to church, that Jesus understands what it means to be emotionally distressed. That's why it says in Hebrews 4:15, you won't see it up there, but maybe take a note of it. Hebrews 4:15, we're told that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but was tempted at all points, yet without sin. That Jesus, he is a God who took on flesh. He lived this life. He faced greater temptations, greater pain, greater emotional distress than any of us. And the comfort for us is that we can go to our high priest who can empathize with our troubled hearts. So go to him today. Go to him with whatever is going on in your life. He understands. He truly does. Jesus provides empathy for my troubled heart. Here's the next one. Jesus provides security for my troubled heart. Look at verses 2 and 3. He goes on to tell his disciples, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and I will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Now, I'm so happy that Jesus didn't stop with just simply saying, "I empathize with what you're going through." I mean, that matters. But it also matters that he's a powerful God who can provide real answers for what we're going through. And here, I see 3 ways that Jesus provides security for us in the storms of life. Here's the first one. Jesus provides the security of eternity in heaven. So in verse 2, he doesn't only comfort his disciples about what they're going through now, he comforts them about where they're going in eternity. He says, one of the reasons I'm leaving is I'm going to my Father's house, and in my Father's house are many rooms, and I'm going to prepare a place for you. You want to know something? You're going to face times in life where the only thought that can bring you comfort is the fact that you have eternity in heaven. Have you ever been there? Where you're searching and grasping and clawing, maybe you're having a sleepless night and you're saying, "I have no peace, I'm emotionally distressed about this relational situation, this situation with my kids, this situation with my health." But you know what? All this is going to end. And someday I'm going to be in the arms of God, and there will be no more tears, and no more pain, and no more weeping, and no more mourning, and we'll probably look back and laugh at some of the things we went through. Maybe you need to take comfort in that this morning, that you have eternity in heaven. I mean, if we had nothing else, that is amazing, isn't it? That is an incredible thing. The Lord has already done far more for us than we deserve by giving us eternity in heaven. And no matter what happens, you cling to Christ. No matter what happens, when you die, you're going to be in glory. And he's telling his disciples that because they were going to die for him. Other than John, who would go write Revelation, right? I mean, they were going to have some hard days. But he said, listen, in my Father's house are many rooms, and someday you're going to be in eternity with me. Jesus provides the security of eternity in heaven. Here's the next one. Jesus provides the security of adoption by the Father. So don't miss the language Jesus uses here. He doesn't just say, I've gone to heaven to prepare a place for you. He says, I've gone to my Father's house to prepare a place for you. Now, the New Testament uses a lot of adoption language for Christians. In fact, if you read Galatians talks a lot about the fact that when we come to Christ, we join a perfect family. And I don't know what type of family you're in or what type of family you came from, but when you come to Jesus, you join a perfect family. It's kind of hard to imagine a perfect family, right? So many of the things we face that are hard in life have to do with our families. But when we come to Christ, we get in a perfect family. I heard one commentator say, it's amazing as Christians how often we go to get food stamps to eat rather than realizing we live in our Father's house. And all the gifts and rights and privileges that come with that are now ours as Christians. And so part of what Jesus is saying here is not just that you have heaven, but he's saying even right now, if you've come to Christ, you have a perfect relationship with a perfect Father. It doesn't matter what kind of father you had in this life. No dad is a dad like our Father in heaven. That's why Paul said when you become a Christian, you can pray, and I find myself praying this way now, saying, Abba, Father, Dad, I need help. My heart's troubled. That's how you can pray to our fathers. That's what Jesus purchased for us. Third, Jesus provides the security of union with Christ. Look at verse 3. He says, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself. Now, Jesus is saying here, not only am I going to make you a place in heaven, not only are you going to be in a relationship with my Father, he's saying, I'm never going to leave you alone again. This doctrine of union with Christ, for all of our talk about justification and sanctification and all of our big Christian words, the doctrine of union with Christ is really the linchpin of the Christian life. It's mentioned over 200 times in the New Testament. In some Bible layouts, that would be on every page. Every page talks about the fact that we are united to Christ himself. And let me make this doctrine, which just means teaching, let me make this teaching of union with Christ very simple for you. Here's what it means. You're never alone again. You're never alone. You could be on the other side of Siberia. I hope that doesn't happen to you. Alone, and you're not alone. You could be Tom Hanks in Castaway on an island, a great movie, right? On an island for 4 years alone, and you're not alone. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, listen, I'm not only going to give you heaven, I'm not only going to give you the Father, I'm going to give you union with me, and you will never be alone again. What an incredible security that is, that the one who rose from the dead, the one who holds the universe together by the word of his power is in us. Maybe you need to take a moment today and remember that security of having Christ in you when you start to get insecure about something. We've got no reason to be insecure. We have Christ. Jesus not only provides the empathy for my troubled heart, he provides security for my troubled heart, and the securities he provides are eternity in heaven, adoption by the Father, and union with Christ. Here's the last one. Jesus provides himself for my troubled heart. In verse 4, he says, and you know the way to where I am going. And Thomas, I love Thomas. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" And Jesus said to Thomas, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." Now, when I say I love Thomas, I really do. I really sometimes feel like Thomas gets a bad rap. Like, I don't think it's fair to a guy who went out and died and was martyred for the Lord to be called Doubting Thomas. But that's a rant, and I won't rant this morning. I mean, Thomas was a guy who in the Gospel of John, he said, when Jesus said, "We're going back to Judea," he said, "Let us go with him and die with him." So, I mean, this guy was on fire for God. He loved him. And so I'm so happy that when Jesus said, "You guys know where I'm going. You know the way to where I'm going," that Thomas said, "No, we don't. I don't. Can you please tell me what the way is?" So many of the times that Jesus says something very famous in the Gospel of John, it's actually introduced by a question from one of his disciples, and I'm so happy they ask those questions. It's like I tell people in my Bible studies, ask stupid questions. Do it, right? But this was not a stupid question. Thomas really genuinely didn't understand what Jesus was saying. And part of this, I think, is if you look at all the religions of the world, even Judaism, it's all about earning and figuring out our way to get to heaven and to get to God. And so when Jesus says he's going away to the Father, he's going to heaven, I think in some ways Thomas was probably thinking, okay, give me the 3 points on how to earn my way there. And so Jesus does not reply that way. Jesus replies with one of the most famous statements in all the Bible. He says, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." I preached a whole sermon on that verse a few years ago. I won't do that now. I really want to, because there's so much here. But when I say that Jesus provides himself for my troubled heart, let's unpack who Jesus is. I mean, when we talk about who he is, I'm going to give you 5 just kind of touch and go points about Jesus himself. So Jesus himself, he says, "I am." And we don't get much further than those 2 little words until we start talking about who Jesus is. When Jesus says, "I am," he is saying, "I am God." In Exodus 3:14, when a man named Moses came to the burning bush and he'd taken his sandals off, right, and he was on holy ground, and he asked God who he was. "What's your name?" And he said, "I am who I am." And every Jewish person who heard Jesus say, "I am," when he made those famous "I am" statements, this is the 6th one in John, when he made those famous "I am" statements in John, they knew he was saying, "I am God." He was uniting himself to Yahweh, the God of the universe. And this is very important to remember when you have a troubled heart. That you don't just serve God with us, Emmanuel. You serve the transcendent God high and lifted up. The I am. That Jesus is someone who provides himself as God and all of God's power and might, to whom little mountains of obstacles we face are nothing, they're dust. That Jesus is the I am, and you have the I am with you as you go through your trial. Jesus himself is the I am. Jesus himself is also the way. Jesus said, "I am the way." Now, before Christians were called Christians, they were called the way. And it's very likely that is because of John 14:6. In the first century after Jesus' death, as the New Testament was being developed, as Christianity was spreading, they were called the way. And the reason for that was because in a Greco-Roman, pluralistic, we have many gods, there's many ways society, does that sound familiar? They said, well, actually, no, there's only one way. And his name's Jesus. And you can imagine that won them a lot of friends. So Jesus makes this statement that he is the only way to God, he's the only way to heaven, and as it pertains to this passage, he is the only way out of a troubled heart. He is the way. He also said, "I am the truth." Famously in John 20, when Pontius Pilate was talking to Jesus, he made that famous three-word statement, "What is truth?" which I think is the best description of the postmodern age. What is truth? And Jesus speaks right into their culture and right into our culture and says, "I am the truth." That's a bold claim. This is very important when we have troubled hearts as well, because when we have troubled hearts, we are fighting to see reality. We are fighting to see the truth. Have you ever been in such a dark place that you are losing your concept of the truth? It happens. It's very easy to happen. And in those moments, it's very important to remember one thing I know is true, and that's Jesus and what he's given me. Jesus said, he said of the word, "Your word is truth." So he said the Bible is truth. His apostles called the church the pillar of truth. So that's why we come to church. This reminds us of the truth. And then we have the Holy Spirit. He called the Holy Spirit the Spirit of truth. And so Jesus is the truth. He's given us his word. He's given us the Spirit. He's given us the church. He is the truth. Jesus himself is also the life. He said, "I am the life." And here, what this means is he is the only place of true meaning, satisfaction, abundant life that can be found. Everywhere else is darkness. That's why he used a lot of language about light and darkness. He's saying if you're looking for life anywhere else, you will not find it until you find it in him. You know, you could go out of here if you've never given your life to Jesus. You could go out of here and you could look for life in drugs and sex and money. I mean, you name it, whatever it is for you, accomplishments, education. And you'll probably come back here in 10 to 20 years and say, I haven't found it. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I am the life. If you want life, you've got to turn to me. That's the only place you're going to find it. And I love this last part because it's almost as if Jesus doubles down just to make sure we don't miss what he's saying. He says, no one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, Jesus, didn't you already say you're the way? We know you're the way. Well, let me make sure you know. Jesus himself is the only way. He's the only way. He's the only way to heaven. He's the only way to a relationship with God. He's the only way to get out of a place of having severe emotional distress and a troubled heart and to find peace and rest. He's the only way. So don't look anywhere else. Look at him. That's the whole point I'm trying to make this morning, that my troubled heart will not find rest until I rest in Jesus. And that's the take-home message as a reminder. So Jesus provides empathy for my troubled heart. Jesus provides security for my troubled heart. And Jesus provides himself for my troubled heart. Now, I was reflecting this week on what this passage has meant for me. I was reminded of this ministry journey I began 7 or 8 years ago. I worked in finance out of college, and that's what I studied undergrad, and then the Lord called me to ministry. But I was reflecting on how I got started. I was living in Michigan, and I was studying in seminary to be a pastor, and I was involved in this church. And I just remember the Lord began to open doors for me in a truly supernatural way. I was leading a life group, and then they said, you know, Billy, you're in seminary. You should probably just be at our sermon meetings. And then at the sermon meetings, the Lord really blessed me, and I helped their sermons. And then one summer day, I was in the pastor's office, and he said, Billy, we're going to have you preach this summer. And I started to laugh because this was a church of 2,500 people. And I'd never preached a sermon. I wasn't on staff. But when I started to laugh, I noticed that he wasn't laughing. So I guess he meant it. And I wasn't laughing when I walked out. I was troubled. I was like, Lord, I don't know if I'm ready for this one. I actually went to my small group, this group of men, the young men that I've been with for a while at that point, and I began talking to them about helping me find a way out of this task. To which they replied, Billy, you've been preaching to us for years anyway. You might as well preach to everybody. I still don't really know if that was an insult or a compliment. I think the point is, they weren't going to let me out of this. And so I started to outline the sermon. I'd never outlined a sermon. I felt like I was just bashing my head against the wall because my outline just didn't make sense. And I began to say, Lord, where are you? Why would you have me do this if you're not going to show up and help me? And little did I know that God was at work behind the scenes. So I've mentioned my mom before. She works at a place called Maranatha, where pastors take sabbaticals. And little did I know there was a pastor on sabbatical that week named Erwin Lutzer. He'd been the pastor of Moody Church for over 30 years, written several books. From a pastoral standpoint, I don't think I deserve to be in the same room as him. Like that type of guy. I respected this guy so much. And, my mom, talked to Erwin Lutzer, and she said, hey, Billy, I told Erwin Lutzer that you're going to be a pastor. He wants to have breakfast with you. So I was like, okay. Little did he know that in just a couple days after that breakfast, I was going to have to present my outline to the staff, and my outline was not ready for that meeting. And so I sit down with him for breakfast. He cracked a lot of jokes. He's a really funny guy. And then I brought up this kind of ordeal I was in, saying, I'm supposed to preach, and I don't even know how to exposit this passage. And he helped me walk through that passage verse by verse, and he also just taught me about how to preach in general and just life. And it was the first time I felt real peace, like the Lord showed up. And I remember him leaving breakfast, and I looked over, and it's one of those moments where it's like the Lord just speaks to you, right? And it's like the Lord said, Billy, that wasn't Erwin Lutzer, that was me. Why don't you trust me? Would I call you to do something like this if I was just going to leave you alone up there? And it was such a formative experience for me. I went on and I preached that sermon, and the Lord blessed it. When I got this job, I think I sent you guys that sermon. And so I have just been reminded this week, why don't we trust him? How many experiences can we look back on in our lives when we had nothing in the tank? We had nothing to hold on to. We were in tears. We couldn't sleep. And Jesus showed up for us. So if you're in that period of time where you are, begging the Lord for help and you're waiting for his answer, you know what you call this period of time? One word: faith. Faith that our God will show up, because our God always shows up. And so keep on trusting him.